Hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining on today's session. So as Judy said, I'm Rick Buck. I'm CPO here at WireWheel, and I'm going to give everyone here an update on CCPA, CPRA. Let's make sure these are working. There you go. So first couple slides, I'm assuming are things that most people on this call already know. But just to do some level setting, CCPA went into effect back in January of 2020. Enforcement of CCPA went into effect the following July. A month after the enforcement started, and after the law was passed and enforcement started, CCPA finalized regulations around how to interpret and comply with the law. CCPA, as you know, had a rich history as a proposition ballot. It was passed quickly, and that's why there were so many regulations. But the driving forces behind CCPA were not happy with the way that CCPA ended up, and yet another proposition, Proposition 14, which eventually turned into the CPRA, was passed back last November. Here we are knocking on the door of its effective date in January. This past July, CPRA regulations were released. They have yet to be finalized. We're going to go through those. But that's kind of a timeline of where we are right now. Again, CPRA is an amendment to CCPA. It's not a new law. The things that it thinks about is enhancing privacy rights for Californians. It gives more consent consideration in specific use cases. It calls for more transparencies in your notices and at your point of collection. It talks more about requirements around privacy impact assessments. It's created the California Privacy Protection Act, the CPPA. As we are all probably aware, CPRA goes into effect on January 1, 23, and enforcement on that starts in July of 23. Let's talk a little bit about the enforcement. CCPA is the law now. It's governed by the Attorney General's office in California, the OAG. The CPRA will be enforced by the new protection agency, the CPPA. They have full investigative enforcement and rulemaking authority, and it'll be interesting to see how they proceed. One of the things that's interesting about CPRA versus CCPA is the concept of this 30-day cure period. Under CCPA, there is a 30-day cure period, which will live through the year 2025, where if you are approached by the agency for a violation, you have 30 days to cure that violation. That 30-day cure period will be expiring in short order. So as the folks at Sephora learned, that's probably something that you should leverage should somebody from California knock on your door. The other interesting thing about the enforcement is that the exemption for employee and HR data, which I think many of us thought was going to get extended, did not get extended. And that beginning January 1, employees' HR data will be considered quote unquote consumer data, and is in scope of all the things that CPRA will tell you that you need to do. In terms of who needs to comply, again, I think this is all the baseline stuff. Your company has to have annual gross million of $25 million a year. You have to annually buy, sell, receive, or share personal information from at least 100,000 consumers. That was increased from 50,000 consumers in CPRA. That your company makes over 50% of your gross annual revenue from selling, and now the CPRA edition, or sharing of personal information. will put you in scope of this law. And again, one of the last things in terms of baseline stuff, under CPRA, personal information has a pretty broad definition. It has all of the usual suspects that you would assume are considered personal information, but noteworthy digital fingerprints and inferences from other personal information that's used to create profiles about your preferences and characteristics is also in scope of what's considered personal information. And I'll take just a quick break here. I want to encourage both questions in the Q&A or questions live, so raise your hand. And I'll certainly attempt to entertain those throughout the presentation. And then, of course, we'll leave room for questions at the end. I do see one question in the chat now about what a cure period is. So the cure period is, as I mentioned, so if you have been approached by the agency that you are in violation of CPRA, or currently CCPA, you have 30 days to cure, to fix, to remedy, to change your business practices so that you are no longer in violation. And then based on the way in which you've reacted to that is the way in which the agency will further react to how they've approached you and what the nature of the violation was.
Someone also asked about the last 4 digits of the Social Security number, Rick. Is that considered?
You know, that's a great question. My own personal opinion is that in isolation, you know, a truncated Social Security number potentially is not personal information. But personal information is really complicated because if it can be used in any way, shape, or form to be linked up with other data to re-identify you, then it's personal information.
We are getting a lot of good questions here about does digital fingerprints include IP address, device IDs?
It does include that, and device IDs and IP addresses are also called out independently as specific pieces of personal information.
And then, thank you, and thanks everyone for these great questions. I think you covered this, Rick, but you talked about enforcement. I just want to make sure we talked about enforcement and that it was in your slide before. I think you talked about how the OAG is enforcing today, and in the future it's going to be the CPPA. That's correct, right?
Yep, correct.
Okay, and so
that was the agency that was created to specifically for enforcement around this law.
And then one last question: are CCTV images considered biometric data?
That's a great question. I honestly, you stumped me on that one. I don't know. I don't know the answer. We'll look into that and get to an accurate answer on that.
Okay, great questions, everybody, about the sort of specifics.
Great questions. Thank you. You're a great group already. So let's talk a little bit about the CPRA regulations to CCPA. Draft regulations were issued by the CCPA back in July. There was a public hearing on the regs that concluded on August 25th. There's still some open commentary and debate on those. The CPPA has not yet approved those regulations, and those regulations are not wholly conclusive on all parts of the CPRA, of the CCPA. It did not address cybersecurity audits. It did not address in full detail risk assessments, and it did not address things like automated decision-making technologies. What it did address are the following. One, you know, much like GDPR, and I'll call this out at the end, but I just want to sort of frame this up now. There are a lot of similarities in California and in the other states that have state privacy laws now that are, you know, have been modeled around GDPR. To say that these laws are GDPR-like or GDPR-light probably is an overstatement, but many of them have contemplated some of the key elements. And so under that vein, I will compare CPRA and CCPA to GDPR. One, there is the concept now of data minimization and data appropriateness, and taking data that is, considering to only take data that is reasonably necessary and proportionate for the processing activities by which you're going to use them. California in the regulations has addressed some of the additional rights. The regulations talk about consent in specific use cases. The regulations talk about notice and the requirements in notice. They address assessments to some degree and call out that assessments need to be done for risky data processing activities and for your service providers. The regulations also call out that service providers should be obligated under contracts to be compliant with the law. And then they talk a little bit about enforcement, and we'll go through all of those individually now. So let's start first with the consumer rights. Under CCPA, rights existed that included access, consent, equality, deletion, and portability. And the new rights now under CPRA are the right to correct your data, the right to opt out of automated decision-making, the right to access the information that was used to make automated decision-making decisions. I know the Department of Redundancy department there. And then also the right to be able to restrict the use of sensitive personal information. And I'll pause here for a moment. Judy, are there questions in the Q&A relevant to this, or are there questions anybody wants to raise now, specifically on the overview of the rights?
Yeah, are there any question on consents or rights? Doesn't look like it yet. We do have a lot of questions, Rick, again, which we'll cover. Keep them coming. We'll cover a lot of these questions at the end if we don't cover them in the presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. I want to call out, so the next couple of slides that I'm going to talk about address consent. And I want to call out first what people would generally think about is opt-in and opt-out. Opt-in quite simply means that a user is required to perform some affirmative action prior to the collection or use of their personal information. So opt-in, I have checked an unchecked tick box. Opt-in, I have hit an agree button to the collection of my data. GDPR, for example, has a very stringent definition of opt-in. Needs to be freely given and specific and informed and unambiguous. CPRA has a looser interpretation of what that means. GDPR requires opt-in for all collection of data. CPRA, CCPA only requires opt-in for specific types of data collection. I bring up the section of implied versus express consent because for two reasons. One, for example, Europe would not consider a pre-check box to be express consent. They would consider that to be implied consent. Canada, interestingly enough, under their current laws, and there probably is a webinar and somewhere in the future on new Canadian laws, although that may be far in the future, as people who are tracking that know that that's been in flux for a while. But right now, under their castle laws, they have the concept of recognizing both implied and express consent. GDPR does not recognize implied consent. And so without getting overly wordy on the opt-in stuff, know that there are different ways to look at what opt-in means. Opt-out is a default assumption that the personal information can be collected and used without consent. So CAN-SPAM, for example, is an opt-out law. CAN-SPAM says I can keep sending you commercial email messages until you tell me to stop, unless, of course, assuming, of course, that everything else about the email that you're sending is compliant. And opt-out also, means that users have the ability to opt out of collection and use of even previously opted-in data. So not to get a little nerdy, but I just thought it would be interesting for you to see definitionally the difference between opt-out and opt-in. Going back specifically to CPRA, CPRA is not in any way, shape, or form an opt-in law, but it now contemplates opt-in in specific use cases. This one may seem obvious, but if you have opted out of the sale of your personal information and want to allow that again, you need to specifically opt back in to do that. If you are offering financial incentives to participate in your programs, you need consent for that. If you are selling or sharing the personal information of minors, you need the opt-in consent of their guardian or their parent. And if you are using secondary or additional uses of data other than was originally disclosed, that also requires an opt-in.
We have a lot of questions, Rick. You
Yes.
ready?
So Judy, I'll let you cherry pick the questions here. And,
okay.
Before we move on.
It seemed to be a lot of questions about automated decision making.
Yeah.
Actually 3. So I'll just read them all and then you can kind of respond. Is automated decision making, does that mean AI ML or any software decision without human intervention? Is automated decision making the equivalent of cross-contextual behavior advertising and targeted advertising? And can you talk about automated decision making and the role of human participants in reviewing, finalizing a decision?
I'm not sure I fully understand the last question, but automated decision making is when humans are eliminated from the decision-making process. So yes, it is AI and ML, and it is decisions that are made by computers to model pricing that consumers might get in an ad, content that consumers might get in an ad. On an HR or employee side, it might be used to segregate candidates applying for a job. It might be used to segregate or qualify employees for promotions. So that is what automated decision making is. And California says that you should have the right to opt out of that, and you have the right to know what the algorithms are on how those decisions are being made.
Okay, so hopefully those answered those questions. And then there's someone made a statement, Michael Conway made a statement. If most people have implemented GDPR for EU operations, then the new right of opt-out, access to, and restricted use should already be accounted for within your processing. Any comments?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I'm glad you asked that. So where GDPR has fully comprehensive opt-out rights, in that specific instance, if you were fully complying with your subject access rights under GDPR, you're likely to be fully compliant under GDPR, but I would be very reluctant to tell you that complying with GDPR means that you are complying with CPRA. So you don't rest on your GDPR compliance in any of the other jurisdictions where you need to be compliant.
And then 2 more sort of questions about these consents. The first is a pre-check box with an I agree button. Would it still be implied?
A pre-checked button that says I agree is implied consent. You did not take an affirmative action to say I agree. It was pre-checked so that you would have to uncheck it. And so the Europeans very specifically don't look at that as express consent. And I would argue that they are correct.
And then this is a statement from someone, which I think is kind of the big question out there, is really about for the right to opt out via GPC. They're wondering if the Sephora result would have been different under CPRA and whether CPRA requires respecting GPC currently.
So that's a great question. That's a webinar unto itself. And there have been many webinars on this exact subject. So there are a couple controversies about GPC, one of which is that under CPA, my interpretation, and it is just my interpretation, but many people will agree with me, is that GPC was written as a signal that was an option to be recognized. And that it was one that they recognized as a valid way for you to express your consent preferences. Under the regulations, GPC has been introduced as something that is mandatory, but the regulations have yet to be finalized. And so many people, without any other of the data points around the CPRA case, because it's a complicated case, without considering any of those other data points, one question that many people have asked is, well, why would, it's right now, GPC is not a requirement. The Attorney General of California very firmly believes and has very vocally stated that it is mandatory under CCPA, and it will be mandatory certainly under CPRA. So I'm not sure if that fully answered the question that was asked, but that's my thoughts on the subject.
Okay, and then one more, then we'll keep going, because you had mentioned that being GDPR compliant didn't necessarily mean that you were CPRA compliant. Is there one example where if you're can you think of an example where you're GDPR compliant but not CPRA?
Yeah, I would say it's with consent. GDPR says you need consent for the collection and use of all data points for all processing activities. And CPRA only says that you need it in specific use cases. And so that alone is reason to say I should be looking very carefully at the gaps between GDPR and CPRA.
Hey, Rick, just to add in here, I think companies need to be really careful.
We have a guest speaker here. It's our another WireWheel employee, Sheridan Clemens, is also on the webinar. So go ahead, Sheridan. Yeah,
I would just say that if companies don't have the same processing activities and have the same setup for the segregation of data and such that they have for GDPR, then they're clearly need to have very careful considerations about what they're doing for CCPA and CPRA, because they may not be the same at all, right? It's you have to ensure that you are applying the same exact processing activities, that you're enforcing your DSAR rights the same way, right? They're two different programs in many different companies. So in many cases, just being GDPR compliant would not mean that you are CCPA or CPRA compliant.
That's correct. Thank you, Sheridan.
Okay, we can keep going. Thanks for everyone's questions. We really appreciate it.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit more about opt-out and what the regulations say. Right now under CCPA, in addition to saying do not sell or share my personal information, the new regulations are going to require that a link to opt out of sensitive information is also presented. And much like the do not sell or share my personal information link, it needs to be conspicuous. It needs to have an immediate effect of opting out, or it needs to point to a web page that gives people full information on how they can better make their choices. And as I just talked about in response to the question, opt-out signals must have a frictionless option. And one example of the frictionless option are the use and acceptance of global privacy controls. Regulation further goes on to say, so look, we understand that we're asking you to put do not sell or share my personal information button there. We understand that we've asked you to also put an opt out of sensitive information button there. And we understand that there are real estate issues on your web pages. And so in order to make that a little bit easier, you can combine the link. And the link should say either your privacy choices or your California privacy choices, and that those links effectuate both your do not sell and your opt out of sensitive information abilities, and again, direct consumers to a website with detailed information on how they can very much and very easily understand what that's all about. I'm going to move on now. Yep, go ahead.
Sorry.
no.
They're asking about, someone is asking about opting back in.
Yes.
So you've opted out. Do you have to allow people to opt back in?
I don't know that you have to allow people to opt back in, but I would certainly say you would want people to opt back in. If you've got the right systems in place, you've got the documentation that shows when they opted out and when they opted back in. So that if there's ever any question about their opt-in status, you're able to document that. If your customers want to jump back on the wagon, I would say by all means let them jump back in. Judy, any other questions on before you move on to privacy policy stuff?
Not yet.
Okay.
But
So let's talk now about the regulations from privacy policy, from the privacy policy and notice requirement point of view. CPRA says that your privacy notice needs to tell California consumers how they can request their rights. It needs to talk about do not sell or share my personal information and have a link to it if you sell. If you don't sell, you should disclose that. Assuming you sell, you need to list the categories of personal information collected or sold in the past 12 months, or again, state that you don't disclose. You need to also disclose the types and the use of sensitive personal information, the sources and categories of personal information collected, and the purpose for each category of personal information. It needs to have an effective date, and it needs to be updated annually. The regulations attempt to provide some more clarity on this, there needs now to also be language that provides appropriate notice around sensitive personal information being used for purposes beyond what it was originally disclosed as, or beyond any other existing authorized purposes under CPRA. The privacy notice also needs to provide information on all of the new CPRA rights, and it needs to talk, and again, all of this in very easy to understand and easy to get to language about all the things in the privacy notice, but the last bullet here specifically around how opt-out signals are processed. So I'll pause here for a moment and see if there are any questions on or around privacy policy stuff.
yeah, yes, we have a couple of questions about the privacy policy. The first one is about kind of if you're collecting, the thing that you mentioned in the beginning, the fact that HR data, employee data is now going to be subject to the regulations. Is it better to have a separate privacy policy around the way an employer handles HR data?
That's a business decision that every company will make on their own. I think it would be, so right now there is no call out that's required. Specifically that you have a section or a separate policy around HR B2B data. But in the spirit of full transparency and in the spirit of what California and other laws are trying to do, I think that's it's wise to have language specifically about B2B data and HR data, whether that's a separate policy or a unique section within your existing privacy policy. I think is a decision that you would make at a company level.
And then there's some questions about sort of back to consents, but just thinking about it in terms of the privacy policy. So if a site does not collect sensitive information, is a link to opt out of it still needed as long as the privacy policy says it's not collected?
So we're awaiting clarification on that. I would say that, certainly you should very clearly understand whether or not, and this same answer goes to the sale of data as well. Because
that
what
was
the
another
sale,
question.
right? So, sale of data falls under this exact category, which is you should really take a hard look along with your privacy team and your legal team about what you're doing with data. And one, is that data considered sensitive? Are your data processing activities considered sensitive? And if so, are those data processing activities and do those data process, are those data sorry, I'm getting tongue tied here. Are the processing activities considered the sale of data? And if you can definitively say and know with a very high degree of confidence that you are not selling data or sharing data, and that you are not processing sensitive data, then you should very clearly disclose the fact that you don't sell or share data and that you don't process or collect sensitive data. Technically speaking, again, this is not legal advice, but technically speaking, by disclosing that you don't do it, it would have seemed that you would not need to have a link for people to opt out of it. But again, these are questions that you should spend a lot of time internally making sure that that is in alignment with your business practices.
So just to confirm, Rick, what's the deadline for privacy policies to comply with the new regulations? Is it January?
Well, so the new law goes into effect on January 1. Enforcement will start July 1.
And then someone asked for, someone said I was under the belief that a privacy policy was different than the privacy notice.
I suppose that's the correct statement, and I don't have a great answer for you on the difference between a privacy notice is probably what you're going to put on your web page, and that many people call a privacy policy. Privacy policy is more inclusive of many other things that are your privacy related policies. That could be your data classification policy. That could be your data destruction policy. And so I guess to be semantically accurate, we should be thinking about the website privacy policy as your privacy notice.
And then there are so many questions. We're not going to be able to, I just want to ask one more and then we'll move on, but we will try to get to as many as we can before the end of the webinar. But someone did ask about, California has so many people who speak for whom English is not their primary language. Has there been any indication that companies will be required to have multilingual privacy policies?
I would say the general thinking on that is that if your website is in multiple languages, that the privacy notice and other options for rights should be in those same languages, should be offered in multiple languages. And that if your customer base, and I'll say customer base as being all encompassing, is multilingual, and you know that it is a multilingual customer base, that you should present those things in a language that's easy for them to understand.
Okay, great. We'll keep going.
Oh yeah, sorry. There's a little bit more about notice of collection. So again, this is more about notice. Under CPRA, you need to say, as I mentioned, the categories of PI, the purpose of the PI, and disclose whether it's sold or shared. The regulation goes on to be a little bit more specific here, and it says that if data is shared or sold, that notice needs to be required before the collection, right? And again, the category of sensitive information needs to be disclosed, and how long that each of those categories of data, the data is actually retained for. An interesting point that they raised here is that if you are a first party and you allow third parties to collect data on your website from consumers, that you must list all the third parties. The third parties must also on their homepage say that they have that relationship with your website, and they need to give you information about what it is that they do with data. An example of that might be an analytics provider who is collecting information about things that are happening on your website, and then helping you aggregate that information. And so I think that's it for collection. And again, I'll open it up just for a last round of questions on notice.
Yeah, I think there were just some questions about PI, sensitive information.
Yep.
If you hold limited PII, such as IP address, device ID, are you still required? to
Yeah,
kind of
so
talk
each
about-
state has different definitions of sensitive information. The things that we would expect to be sensitive information: health, financial, religious, political, sexual, any of information like that is considered sensitive information. Specific geolocation. So IP address unto itself, I don't think is considered sensitive, but specific geo is considered sensitive. The sale of data for targeted advertising in some states is considered, and I believe California is considered sensitive information. It's important, again, as I said earlier, it's important for you guys to have discussions with your privacy teams. If you are the privacy teams, to have discussions with your marketing teams and your legal teams, so that everybody really understands what the definition of things like sensitive data are, what the definition of sell and share is, what you're doing to be able to handle your rights requests, the privacy notice, all of that, that you're in alignment, in this case in particular, with CPRA, but certainly, thinking about that across all the jurisdictions in which you do your marketing.
Okay, and real quick, Rick, you said the laws go into effect Jan 1, enforcement starts June 1. Is that what you said?
Yep.
Okay.
July 1, sorry.
Sorry, July 1.
Yep.
That was by mistake. Okay.
But,
Right,
and I
great.
will say this again later in the presentation, CCPA is in effect. CCPA is being enforced, and very aggressively being enforced. And you should expect that CPRA will follow suit, and that CCPA violations will be issued, in a fairly visible way over the coming months. California is adamant about the way in which they've approached privacy, and in many respects, my hat's off to them. I think they are taking a really good stab at this, and they want marketers and companies and businesses to know that that the law is important and that they intend to enforce it. Let's move on to privacy impact assessments. So there are regulations that are forthcoming that are going to talk more particularly about what privacy impact assessments need to look like. But what we know now is this: one, that assessments are required for any risky data processing, and that's data processing that creates significant risk to a consumer from a privacy or security point of view. And that includes, as I just said, sensitive data, marketing to minors, targeted advertising, sharing and selling personal information, anything of that nature. So, PIAs need to be done around that. The other area that was added in terms of where PIAs are necessary is around service providers, contractors, and third parties. And again, much in the way that GDPR looks at this, CPRA is saying that not only are you accountable for complying with the law, but any of your downstream vendors that process data on your behalf are also responsible for upholding that, and that you should do your diligence around all of those vendors, including data brokers and ad tech vendors who are processing data on your behalf. So any questions around that? I'm going to talk a little bit more about service providers and contractors next.
Yes, there is a question about can doing the impact assessment one time be accepted, or do they expect processes in place to not only assess new data points, but assess existing ones, whether changed or not?
Yeah, so again, we're waiting for further clarity on that. Here's my point of view on that is: one, these assessments should be done initially to make sure that you're in compliance. But even if you're not complying with a specific law, assessments around these kinds of activities should be done anytime there is a change to that processing activity, or anytime a new processing activity is created around a particular category or type of data that you're collecting. So if there's a change in your business process, if there's a change in the way you are using data, then you should be assessing that change and making sure that it's compliant. So, you know, beyond how often you should do it and what specifically that assessment needs to ask, you know, you should just be thinking in general, what am I doing with my data? Have I taken a close look at it? And does it align with the things that I need to in my business practices? And does it align with the things that it needs to in the jurisdictions where we're going to be using that data?
So you have sensitive data minors, targeted advertising. Someone asked how you define targeted advertising.
Yeah, so targeted advertising is advertising that's done based on aggregate data on you know, websites that you go to, websites that you came from, things that you clicked on a website, how long you stayed on a page, what you purchased, and then that's all algorithmically decided by the advertiser or by the, you know, who's sending you the advertisement, what kinds of advertising they're going to push to you.
And then there's a question about Google Analytics. So like examples of like working with a company like Google or Google Analytics, what do you think about a PIA when it's really not clear what Google does with that data?
Yeah, again, we're waiting for more clarity on analytics providers, but do those PIAs the best that you are able to do them. You know, a company like Google Analytics is not going to fill out your privacy impact assessment. They'll have data that can be extracted from their website, and you can answer questions within your assessment appropriately. And then, you know, whether it's Google or any other vendor, you know, based on those data points, you'll be able to make decisions on whether or not that's an analytics provider that you have confidence that has the integrity for you to work with.
Okay, great.
Okay, I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit more about service providers and contractors. Under CCPA, service providers were called out as third parties that perform specifically contracted business functions on behalf of a business. And service providers would be, so they're just, that you've hired somebody to do things with your data so that you can provide a service to your customers. And to your customers or to your consumers. And I say consumers because employees are now going to be considered consumers. That would include things like your payment processors. That would include things like, you know, potentially your HR or your payroll provider. These are, again, vendors that help facilitate the business service offering. They don't monetize that data. They don't do anything with that data other than help you do what you do as a company. CPRA has further expanded that definition to include contractors and third parties as another category that also needs to be held accountable for processing your data. These are third parties who you contract with, who may do an assortment of services for you. These may be data enhancement providers. These may be, again, analytics providers. These may be ad tech services. And so they now also fall under that category of needing to be assessed as a company that will be able to be accountable and is able to abide by CPRA. Note, again, much like in the Sephora case, the use of analytics, ad tech, data enhancement services is likely to put the way in which you're using data under the definition of sale. And as such, you have all the obligations under CPRA to treat data because it's being sold in the appropriate manner. So again, before we move on, so I'll talk a little bit more contractors, then I'll open it up for questions on this section. As I just mentioned, the definition of service provider now includes contractors, and service providers are contractually obligated to upholding CPRA commitments. Your contracts need to have, you know, some language in there that certifies that your vendors are going to comply with those contracts. If they subcontract work out to other vendors, they need to also be held accountable by contracts, and there should be language in your contracts about that. They need to help you cooperate with your subject requests. So they don't necessarily have to fulfill a subject request, but if one of your customers is smart enough to figure out that that vendor also processes data and reaches out to that vendor to say, hey, what do you know about me? Then that vendor is obligated to reach back out to you, the data controller, to say that this has come in and we need to address this. Most importantly, now it is saying that service providers and contractors are prohibited from combining any personal information they receive from businesses with personal information from sources that they've collected or from their own. So they can't commingle data, they can't aggregate that data, they can't monetize that data in any way, shape, or form. In terms of the contracts, and we're waiting for, again, some more clarity on this, but your contract should have language in there that talks about the prohibition of selling or sharing customer personal information. Your contracts must say that the vendor needs to align their privacy protection and security practices with yours. They need to be able to notify your company within 5 business days if they can't meet any of these obligations. And you, as the data controller, have the right to stop and remediate the services that those folks are providing for you if they're using your data in an unauthorized way. And then again, that the PIAs are required for the service providers. So again, before we move on to the next section of this, questions about service providers, contractors, contracts, assessing those vendors.
Yeah, so there was a question early on about how, and I just want to confirm, or if I don't know if you have anything more to add based in this section, but someone asked about how this impacts digital advertising agencies. Is there anything additional you would add to what you just said, or do you feel like you covered?
Yeah, so what I would say in general is that if you are in the digital agency world, if you are, and when I say that, I mean on whether you're the publisher or the advertiser, whether you're the buyer or the seller of data, you are highly likely to be selling data. And as such, you need to make sure that you have the appropriate disclosures, that you have the appropriate permissions, that you have the appropriate opt-out paths, that you've done the appropriate diligence around assessing your vendors, and make sure that you have your ducks in a row. Is probably the best way that I can answer that question, but I don't have specific prescriptive information yet about that world.
Thanks.
Okay, so we're getting to the end of the webinar, and again, just I would not say that CPRA is GDPR light, but I like that CPRA and that the other states who have passed privacy laws are at least starting to align with the way Europeans are thinking about data. One, there's a requirement that privacy impact assessments are done around high risk processing and around your service providers and third parties. That the concept of data minimization and only using data that's reasonably necessary and proportionate are considered. That limitations around what kinds of use cases you can have and how long you should be keeping data, and that consent and security are things that are important to the privacy story now. Is where we'll see is where we see alignment with CPRA. And with our friends across the pond. But again, to the question that was asked earlier, and this question has been asked countless times since these new state laws have come into effect, just because you're GDPR compliant doesn't mean that you are CPRA compliant. It means you're generally pointed in the right direction, but there are a lot of differences in the things that you need to do or don't need to do in both of those laws. you should spend time internally. Certainly spend time with folks here at WireWheel about coming to terms with that, and then effectuating strategies to support that.
So Rick, with our 6 minutes left, we have a ton of questions about the employee requirement.
Yeah.
And maybe we need to do another webinar, but I just want to try to get to as many as we can in the next couple of minutes. And we will do our best. We have all these questions. We will respond, or in the end, I'll give you my email and Rick's email if you want to reach out directly. But in particular, so to start, just want to confirm that a company has to meet kind of the 3 thresholds: 25 million, 100,000 households, 50% revenue from sharing, selling data required to respond to employee rights requests. Do we know?
I would say that's probably true. You either, I mean, again, I can't tell you as legal advice, but it's fairly binary. You're either in scope or out of scope of the law.
And then someone asked a specific question about contractors of exempt government activities. Do they have the same immunities, exemptions under CPRA?
Likely they will be, and again, this is not a definitive answer, likely they will be considered part of your workforce. And if you do need to comply with CPRA, that they would be offered those rights as part of your workforce, and available to get to exercise their privacy rights.
And then someone asked a question, and this is probably similar, around employees versus independent contractors. And if personal information on a contractor was obtained before effective date of the statute, is there a continuing obligation to send notices?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would say under the guise of CPRA has a 24-month, a 12-month look back on data being processed. The short answer to that question might be yes, but I don't have a better answer to that question at the moment.
And then I'll ask one more question. Unfortunately, we've kind of run out of time, but we will have all these. We can post on a blog our answers. We'll post on our website the answers. And again, you can reach out to each of us. But there's a lot of questions about kind of employee sensitive data. So obviously there's a ton of sensitive data that's collected on employees, payroll, benefits, contacts, diversity inclusion surveys, things like that. So is this, the question is this data like exempt from the notices of consent regarding sensitive data, or how?
Yeah, this
how
is
should
going to be a
company think
really
about
complicated issue. Because in addition to the things that you've just mentioned, Judy, is that, so if I'm an employee and I'm asking for what do you know about me, and where do you have data about me, that data exists in a number of places, including my texts, including my emails that were done on my work equipment. And those texts and emails contain information about other employees. And those other employees' personal information are completely out of scope of what's being requested. And so you have employee data, other employee data, you have sensitive data, you have data that might be involved in some, in an employee dispute for a litigation case or something of that effect. And so the question is, what data will you be obligated to present, and what data should you redact, and what data points that you'll be obligated to provide back to the employee. And we're going to need to get a lot more clarity from California on specifically how to comply with that. It's going to be a very complicated issue.
Yeah, thanks. So we will continue. We'll probably do another webinar on this when we have more information. And there have been a lot of questions about sharing the presentation and the deck. Sorry, the recording and the deck both will be available on the WireWheel website. And Rick, I'll let you close it out.
Okay, so I'll whiz through these next 2 slides really quickly. Obviously, we wanted to educate you on the law, but also want to remind you that, WireWheel's here to help. We have tools around data governance to help you with inventories and mapping. We have tools to help you, manage and present your privacy policies. We have tools to help with your privacy impact assessments and your vendor compliance. We have tools to help with honoring your subject rights fulfillment. We are soon to have tools to help you manage your consent and preference signals and controls. And all of that being said is available, very easily. Reach out to your existing contacts here at WireWheel. If you're not a current customer, we'd be happy to speak to you about being able to help you with this stuff. In sort of a wrap up to this, one of the things that we do have readily available now is our CPRA readiness assessment, which will do a preliminary gap analysis around where you are compared to where you were for CCPA. Sheridan, I'm glad you were able to join us today. I'll give you a moment just to talk very briefly on the CPRA assessment, and then we can wrap up today's session.
Sure. My apologies for the noise in the background. Yeah, we've set up a quick readiness assessment for folks to fill out. It's I think it's like 40 questions or so, just to give you a general idea of sort of the requirements that are new for CPRA. Once you complete it, we'll put together a nice big report of some recommendations that are customized for your organization, and we'll share it with you. And happy to set up some time and talk you through it and answer any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you, Sheridan.
Yeah, so the link is here, and also we put the link in the chat.
Great.
So thanks
So I
for
think
being
we've run out
such
of time for questions. I think we've answered a lot of questions during the session. These were great questions. Please continue to send them into us, and we'll address them if we can directly back to you. I am going to turn the presentation back over to Judy. Before I do, thank you everyone for joining. We had a huge crowd today. We really appreciate your interest in listening to the information that we presented to you today. So I thank you for your time. Thank you, Judy, and to the folks at WireWheel for pulling this all together. And Judy, I'll hand this back to you to wrap it all up.
Yeah, so our last slide is we have a twice a year at WireWheel, we hold a privacy technology conference. And our next one is December 14th and 15th. So we just wanted to let you know, you can register on our website, or if you're interested in speaking, we're looking for speakers. You can look at our website and fill out the form for speaking. Thank you all for being such a great audience and for all your questions, and we'll do our best to respond back in a blog or somehow on our site. And yes, the presentation and the deck will be available at wirewheel.io. And as Rick said, we offer a lot of solutions, including solutions for subject rights request, privacy operations to help you with NEPAs, and a consent management solution. There were a couple of questions in the Q&A about that, and we'd be happy to speak to you about our solutions. Thank you.
Thanks again, everybody. Bye now.